Okay, so today we're going to talk about some kind like interviews to look out for during the data science interview process. I've sort of categorized it into four different kinds of interviews. You can see here, these are the four kinds. I'll talk about each one. Not every company has the same interview process, so be very aware of that. I will say they always have like some form of a first round interview, duh. But whether they have these other components, they might be out of order. It really is company dependent. So don't expect that all of these interviews will be part of your process. This is drawn from my experience, from my students' experiences, from my classmates' experiences. So just be aware of that as well. I might not be like super comprehensive on everything. But I thought that this could be, a good place to start in order to like just know what to expect. So when, after I would say the hardest thing is getting that first interview. I think that's something that career coaches also acknowledge, and just getting your foot in the door. Anyone who's been part of any recruiting process can attest to that. That is the hardest part. I think like out of the close to like 200 job applications I sent out when I graduated, I maybe only heard from like less than five, which I know doesn't sound very encouraging right now. But I will say I do think that the ones that do get back to me, I've had like really meaningful experiences from. And also throughout like my time working, I've been doing contract work on the side. So I've been pretty much consistently either working on something or interviewing for something. So that's kind of where my experience draws from. I know a lot of you know that I started this job right after graduating from the boot camp. So if anyone is, I don't know, if anyone is doubtful, that is where my experience comes from. I will also say that most of my interviews are for part-time roles or contract roles, which I am aware mostly you're not looking for that kind of thing. But I do think some of the processes are very, very similar. So just disclaimers before I begin. So let's just go in order of this. This is the order that I've seen kind of the most. I would say like the last two sometimes flip, but yeah, they're all kind of targeting different parts of your expertise. So yeah, let's talk through it. So pretty much every company that I've interviewed with starts with some sort of first round screener or introductory interview. This is really for them to get to know you, to make sure that you are someone that they will want to work with. It could be coupled with a cultural interview, even though not explicitly so. I do think that this first round, you do want to come across, I mean, to put it crudely, as likable as possible to whoever's interviewing you. If you don't set a good impression, I do think that will not uh, propagate forward very well. So think of it as a cultural interview. And from this, I'd say something to look into is get to know the company. It's very, very important that you know the job that you're interviewing for, not just the job description, but also the company that you're working for. This allows you to be able to ask meaningful questions towards the end of the interview, because usually they ask you if you have any other questions. So to prepare for this, definitely research the company, and the position. On top of that, think of meaningful questions to ask them. And by meaningful, it does depend. One thing I like to ask is, what are some problems that you or your team are working on that I would be part of solving, or the person who the person who you will hire for this position will be tasked with solving. Let's see, what kinds of problems are you solving? And also, if it's in an industry that you care about, try to formulate questions that show that passion. I do think that, I guess, yeah, I do think so. In the past, I've also interviewed people for Flatiron School in terms of other instructors and prospective students as well. The people who've tended to impress me the most are the people who sort of know more about what we do, which I know can be hard if you don't know anyone in the company, but just show that you've done some reading. Maybe they have like a prominent leadership figure. Say that one thing I like to do is see if their like CEO or anyone in their C-suite has done any like talks or interviews, and just read through that, because sometimes during those like moments they will talk about what their company is working on. Um, and yeah, I think the whole idea here is to try and align yourself with their company's culture. So I think that's something important too. Um, Try to align yourself with the company culture. So that's more of like the cultural aspect. As part of this interview, they will pretty much always ask, tell me a little bit about yourself. About yourself. And for this, you talk about your experience, talk about, I think as bootcamp students, talk about your shift from whatever industry you were in the past to data science, and how you found your way to data science, and why it's so interesting to you, stuff like that. So you would talk about your history, your journey to data science or analytics. During this time, during this interview, not all the time, but sometimes you get asked very high level concept questions. So prepare some concept questions, or prepare to study for some conceptual questions. Study for conceptual questions. So these are the questions that I've basically linked in the homeroom before. I'll link it here. So these are the concept questions, things like stats. I get a lot of questions about linear regression for some reason, as well as different models. So something I've been asked is like, all right, how does a random forest work? And you're just not expected to like break down the algorithm completely, but just talk about, I don't know, just talk about, I would say like a 2 to 3 sentence summary of how each model works. So actually, let me add that here, 2 to 3 sentence summary of each, especially if they have your resume. If you know that they have your resume on hand, get ready to talk about the models that you end up using in your projects. So yeah, let me hyperlink that here. So conceptual questions, they may or may not ask. I haven't been asked conceptual questions at every first round interview. It really depends on whether the person interviewing you is technical or non-technical, I find. So yeah. During this time, they might also ask you to tell them about some of your projects. So they'll be like, tell me about one of your projects. This is something that you can definitely prepare ahead of time. I kind of have 2 main strategies to go about this. One, if I know it's someone more technical, I talk about the project that I can explain more technically. Like for example, I would talk about my capstone, where I really did a deep dive into how like the recommendation system algorithm worked. Versus if I know if it's someone that's non-technical, I talk about a project that was particularly challenging and how I, got around those challenges. So there are ways to prepare this. But yeah, this part is, I think, really subjective, up to you, whichever one you're more comfortable talking about. I would say prepare not just 1, but 2 projects at least, just in case they want to hear different scenarios. You can, adapt one of those stories to whatever scenario they're asking about. One time, which is actually one of the contract jobs that I did end up getting, the question was, tell me about the most challenging project, which is why I was lucky to have that prepared beforehand. But yeah, most of the time they just ask you to tell them about one of your projects, or something that you're working on, Cool. I would say for the first round of interview, it's usually just over the phone, even before COVID. I've had it over Zoom a couple times. But yeah, honestly, most of the time in my memory, first round interviews are over the phone. So you're not expected to like prepare to code anything at that moment. I will say this is a very, very like amalgamation of all of a bunch of different experiences. So yeah, does anyone have any questions regarding this? All right. So after the first round, usually the coding or the problem solving technical interview, I would say after you get through the first round, getting to the second round is pretty easy if this is the second round. Um, just because these are usually like a link that they send out to you. And for this, definitely you want to, oh, and this would be like the coding or problem solving technical interview, where it's like hacker rank style questions. It will be like Python problem solving questions where you like define a function that does this, or write a loop that computes this, something like that. So you definitely want to practice HackerRank, hackerrank.com. Wait, why isn't it hyperlinking automatically? All right, it's okay. I'll hyperlink it later. LeetCode is another good one. I will say LeetCode is more for like software engineering, data structures, algorithm stuff, which data science interviews don't tend to have, but LeetCode also has some good Python/SQL ones. So yeah, it can also be Python or SQL, depending on the job. So 2 ways I've had this done. The first way is they literally send me like a HackerRank link or something similar to HackerRank, where they kind of have it like a proctored, not a proctored test, but it's basically like a timed test. Test URL, where they give you a link with a couple questions for you to solve within a certain time limit. Solve within a time limit. I've had quite a few companies that have sent me literally like HackerRank links, and I guess for businesses, you can like put together HackerRank tests. So I've gotten a few interviews where it's like 4 HackerRank questions. I can just click on different tabs and like code out my answers for the different ones, which is why I think it's a good idea to practice on HackerRank, just because HackerRank sometimes has like a unique way of taking in inputs and outputs that if you practice on there, you get used to those, to seeing those, and when it comes to an actual interview, you won't get like tripped up over that. So that's one of them. It could be Python questions, SQL questions. I've actually had a couple that are both, like 2 Python questions, 2 SQL questions. So yeah, there's that kind, but there's also a kind where you're actually live coding with someone else. Live coding or pair programming with someone else, where I guess it's not exactly pair programming, because in this case you are both the driver and the navigator. But this I've had with a few companies. I know big companies tend to do this method more because they just have a lot of engineers on hand to conduct these interviews. So this is likely with an engineer that works for the company. This is just in my experience, disclaimer. Companies that I've done this with, Bloomberg does their interview like this, I know. Who else? If anyone has heard of TripleByte, they're like sort of a kind of like a Flatiron school, but they also like help you get, but they more focus on like the job aspect. They do interviews like that. Who else have I interviewed with? A couple of the contract jobs that I've had, they do that too. So they basically pair you up with somebody during a meeting time, and that person will present you with a question. And then you just talk through your thought processes and you basically live code. You are allowed to Google, in my experience. I haven't heard of any where you can't Google, or you can ask them like, do you remember the function to do something like that? I don't think that has ever hurt me. As long as they know what you are trying to do, remembering exact syntax is not as important. So they present you with 1 to 2 like problems or questions to solve with Python. So yeah, that is one way to, that is one interview type as well. Let me think, is there anything, does anyone have any questions about this interview type? Remembering syntax is not as important, but more so it's to judge your thought processes and ways of thinking, or like problem solving, judge your problem solving processes.
For the hacker rank type ones, can you Google there, or can you debug? Like, do you have to get it right the first time?
So In my experience, there's like a test case button where you can just run test cases and that one won't submit. So yeah, you can test your code. Um, you can, I know HackerRank specifically, they don't care if you have other windows open. So I actually remember doing mine in like a Jupyter notebook and then just copying and pasting and making sure that the code also runs. Um, so yeah, whether you do that, it really that part is kind of up to you. But HackerRank, I'm sure you can test your code before submitting it for sure. And you can also Google because they don't really care what else is open. And if you Google, I think they probably check this out, but if you Google, you cannot find the exact answers. I've tried. um, but yeah, so you should be able to Google. But yeah, I will say for the I will say I think in terms of the kinds of questions they're asking, in my experience, the hacker rank ones are easier because you're I guess kind of expected to solve them. Whereas for the ones where they pair you up with somebody else, I've actually never been able to like successfully finish coding an entire problem. Rather, I've just like pseudo coded or at least talked about what my function would do. I don't know if that's because I'm slow, or I don't think so. I don't know. But those questions are a lot more challenging. They really challenge you to like, it's a big problem that you usually have to break up into smaller pieces. So I guess that's another tip. Think about breaking up your problem into smaller problems. Um, your problem into how do they know into smaller problems. Um and oh, I was going to say one more thing, but as I'm thinking, anyone have any other questions on this? Ooh, yeah. The thing I was going to think about, kind of random, and I have mentioned this a couple times, I think at one-on-ones, but um, through practice and through like reading what other people say about these kinds of interviews, whenever you need to store data, and this is a very like kind of specific thing, but whenever you need to store data to look up in the future, store it in a dictionary. Rather than a list, because dictionary lookup, you just have to call the key, whereas if you store everything in the list, you would have to filter out the list later. So that's a big tip that just made the problem solving process a little bit easier, because you can break things down into like, what is a value that you might need to look up later. um, and then I don't know, that learning that tip helped me a lot in like having more ease in breaking up the problem. I don't know if that makes sense without a specific example, but if you have a problem that you store information in, try and think about if you can store it in a dictionary, because it becomes a lot more efficient. Also, um, in my experience, I'm not too sure about other people, but the people who are conducting these interviews tend to be software engineers. So because of that, they are looking for, in some ways, efficiency, which honestly comes from practice. If you see like one kind of problem and you see how to solve it, um, I think, yeah, a lot of like the concepts of problem solving are kind of similar. So once you see a lot of problems and you've done a lot of practice, when you get a question, you usually know, all right, what my first steps are. I haven't done something like this in a while, to be honest, but when I was about, let's see, this is about like 8 months ago, I think. I was doing a lot of hackering, a lot of leak code, and then during interviews, I would see a question and it would always ring a bell of another similar question. So I think there is some benefit to just doing a lot of practice. I know some of my students, I'm less disciplined, so I don't do this, but I have some students that would set up some time like every day or every week to get like a certain number of these questions solved. What's pretty neat is that on HackerRank, there is a forum for, I think, almost every question, where you have people talking about how they have gone about solving the problem. So that's why I like HackerRank a lot. But yeah, anything else before I talk about the next thing? All right. So next is a take-home interview, and the take-home interview can sort of exist in different ways. Um, I would say one of the ways is through a case study. Actually, yeah, a lot of them are case studies where they present you with maybe a fake problem, maybe a real problem that they kind of like change some of the constraints around just so that they want to see how you would use the tools that you have to solve whatever the problem is. So you're presented with a business problem, and the idea is to use whatever you have in your toolkit to best tackle the problem. Um, this doesn't necessarily have to be done with code. I've had certain case studies where they're like, just give me like a 2-page Word document on your process. So can be done, oh, it doesn't have to be coded, can be pseudo-coded, or an action plan. That's what it's called. Or it can be an action plan. It can be suitable or an action plan. All right, yeah. I'll read through this before I send it out to make sure every sentence is coherent. But yeah, there have been cases where I've been presented with business cases, and they're like, okay, we have this data. How would you maybe like solve the problem of, I don't know, predicting real estate prices, for example? And then you could talk about, all right, I will set up my data frame to look like this. Something else that I've thought about is like, do think of caveats. Think of caveats and edge cases to account for. Yeah. Oh, something I forgot to mention. The take-home interview is sometimes timed, or sometimes there's a due date. Timed or given a due date. So I've had, by timed, I mean that they'll send me the problem at like 12 p.m. and expect it back at like 4 p.m., for example. And you usually have some flexibility in telling them the time that you want to work on it. Or they'll say like, oh, get this back to us in a week, something like that. Or like by this date, by this time. So yeah. So case studies, I've had only one case study that I've had to code out. All of mine have been kind of like pseudo coded or more of an action plan. The ones that I've had are all like done within a day. They'll like allocate 3 to 4 hours where they'll say, all right, take this project, look over it, and give us a business plan within the next 4 hours. And then they'll like set up another time where you talk through it, sort of very similar to like how we do our project reviews actually currently. But yeah, in the one case where I had to code it out, I will say it was for a very technical job, so I actually had to hard code gradient descent and stuff. Not many people have had that experience. I think because of the jobs that I was looking for more like machine learning engineering roles at the time. Therefore, they had me do that. But I've seen actually my classmates work on take-home interviews where it's actually very similar to a mod project, a phase project. So just one option, it could be very similar to completing a phase project. But again, it does depend on what they give you. The whole idea is, are you able to use your data science tools to support their business case? So whatever data science tools you have in your toolkit to best tackle the problem. So 2 things they're looking out for. 1, are you able to, connect your technical with the non-technical? But 2, are you able to think more critically about their business case? Like think from their shoes. It's very, very case by case, but try and, I don't know, put yourself in their shoes as much as possible. Think about what they would be thinking about. Again, it does also tie back to um, your understanding of what the company does. I would say also what I found very helpful is ask as many questions as you can if you're allowed to. Like as they're setting this up for you, if you come up with questions along the way. I've done this a couple times where I send back a list of questions like, all right, is this a constraint, or um, am I allowed to use data, or are we able to get this kind of data? I've gotten answers on those, mostly vague. Or I think one time they're like, you can assume that we don't have any other data, for example. They will tell you constraints. But yeah, does anyone have any questions regarding this kind of interview?
In the first bullet point, when you use the toolkit, it means the things that we have learned so far, or
Oh,
the libraries that they mentioned that we should use.
things that you have learned. Yeah. So literally like concepts that you're aware of. Yeah.
Okay,
So
thank
not specific libraries, unless you're asked to like actually code something out. Um, they usually won't go into detail about libraries because that I think to some level is already expected. Anything else? All right. Well, finally, there's a Q&A style technical interview. I will say this um, sometimes happens, in my experience, this happens like at the very end, where they really want to just make sure that your knowledge is aligned with the role. So this can get really, really specific. To prepare for this, I actually like to ask in prior interviews, what are technologies that you all use? So to prepare for this, ask in prior interviews about the technologies, libraries they use. I would say one time caught me by surprise, but there was a job that I had applied for. I didn't end up getting it. Actually, one of my students did, which is awesome. But one time they were like, you have to know how to write Excel macros or work in VBA or something. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I like promptly did like a 2-hour course on VBA just for that interview, which was very, very hard because I did not know VBA. But anyways, so that me asking that question really prepared me for that part. So I was able to at least not look like a complete fool and not knowing anything. So yeah, that's a lesson I definitely learned from that. The kinds of questions they would ask here, um, I've had I've been in situations where they will, I guess at that point, because there's still some non-disclosure, maybe, I don't know, but they basically talk about the actual problems that they're trying to solve that they haven't solved yet. They extract it a little bit so they're not divulging any information, and they just want to see how you would go about solving a problem that they are facing. So a lot of times it's solving problems, or not solving, but attempt to solve problems that the company's problems that the team that, what's the grammar here that the team is currently facing, that currently working on. I'll read over my grammar later, but yeah. So for example, there was one data engineering role. It was more like a data and like a more data science data engineering role where you also had to work with a database. And so they had asked questions about, all right, let's say we wanted to store let's say our data is stored this way. Currently, we have a problem where this doesn't really connect with this. What are some edits you would make in the data collection process to make it such that the data will be able to integrate with each other? That's one example of a question I was asked. Um, Another one I was asked is like, all right, the next thing we're going to work on, we're actually going to build a recommendation system for this. Due to that, because of this, and if you had free reign to decide what data we'll use, what kind of data would you like to collect if you could collect any data? That's actually a question I've got for my last contract job, which was very, very interesting. I did actually end up getting to use the data that I asked for, which is awesome. But yeah, these are all like smaller companies, so I definitely had a lot more freedom there. But yeah, I think this part is very, very, I think this is the hardest part for me to speak about because every experience has been very different. I would say also very likely because the people talking to you here will be different from the people talking to you at every other interview. Do be prepared to talk about some of the same things. If it's a technical interview and you know that, something I forgot to mention is like, usually these are the people that you will end up working with. So this will be likely with people you'll be working with, or the people whoever they hire will be working with. So they are a lot more technical usually, or they will be more familiar with the role itself. So here, I would say you can definitely talk about your projects in much more detail. Talk, and this is really only if they ask, and in my experience, they do sometimes ask, but yeah, talk about your projects in much more technical detail. But yeah, this part I would say in my last couple of experiences, these are all like the final round interviews where one, they need to just make sure that your knowledge aligns. And if it doesn't align, that you are able to adapt to align. Mostly they just want to see that you're willing to learn. Usually just by the nature of being bootcamp students, the fact that you have like taken this whole new field in like the past, 4 months, you can use that as a testament to your ability to like pick up new skills. Definitely talk about that. But yeah, this part is harder to talk about because it becomes very, very specific to like the exact project you would be working on, the exact people you'll be working with. So you also want to be likable to them. But yeah, this is the one I have the least experience with getting to final round interviews just by the nature of it being final round interviews. But yeah, any questions about or anything I've talked about overall?
Can you make an example about technical detail?
Oh yeah. So maybe you want to talk about model hyperparameters. So I remember one of my interviews, I actually talked about my image classification project. And I also admitted that when I was working on the project, I really didn't fully understand how neural networks worked. And then I would just go back and say that, all right, upon, restudying what I was doing, I realized that, some, like, for example, what was the example that I used? I think I had noticed that my something about like activation functions, that I was using an activation function that wasn't optimal for the problem I was trying to solve. And then just being able to talk about that, one, just use it as a way to like throw in as many like little nuggets of information you're aware of that you can. But yeah, you can get really technical in terms of like, you can talk about the exact algorithm that you use. So for example, another one I like to talk about SVD with recommendation systems a lot. So I kind of like turn it into a conversation, be like, oh, I'm happy to talk about the algorithm. I think is really cool. One, I think it shows that you can nerd out about these things, which I think some people appreciate. I don't know, that's just the way I am. But I kind of take the opportunity to like share that I know how an algorithm works. Of course, weave it into the conversation naturally. I know that's not always easy. But yeah, in terms of technical detail, I do mean like show that you understand what you're doing. You're not just writing lines of code to like interpret results. Yeah, was that helpful? I think it also depends on like the projects that you have on your portfolio. So for like linear regression, as you're maybe explaining your coefficients, while you're explaining like your coefficients or your conclusions, you can maybe go into more depth talking about like, yeah, well, these coefficients were derived from it fitting a linear model, so therefore there might be some drawbacks, something like that. So yeah, at these stages, you can usually assume that your interviewer knows more about these technical processes. So you can use that as an opportunity to show that you know these technical processes.
Is it common to have sort of a portfolio review as part of this, where they want you to present in front of a group of people?
So I've actually,
that sort of thing.
I've never done that. I have had some classmates where they go in an interview and they were told to bring their computer and have their projects open. I know Amazon, I forget what was the job title, but I remember it was for an Amazon job that one of my classmates had to do that and actually walk through their code. very, very nerve-wracking, but I will say that doesn't happen too common. In terms of like doing your non-technical presentation, no, you don't have to. I've never been in this, and I've never heard of anyone being in a situation where you have to like present your PowerPoint slides that you have on your GitHub. The non-technical presentation is more for the purpose of, are you able to convey your technical thoughts to a non-technical audience? And that's more of like practice for being able to speak about your projects in some of these other scenarios. So I've never really had to present my project to somebody like me presenting information to you. It's usually more like conversational, where they ask you questions about specifics and then you you just tell them about it. But not to say that it cannot happen. Again, every company does things slightly differently. So it is hard to say, but based on what I've heard from other students, no one has had to like stand up and present in front of a group of people their projects. But I have had like these technical interviews. Most of the time there's like 2 or 3 other people in the room, or when I was doing it was in the room. So yeah, they'll just like take turns asking me about just stuff that they're curious about. I guess I think at that point they know that you are at least capable enough, but I think they also want to just see that your problem solving and your, I guess sometimes your domain knowledge, like whether you have adequate understanding of the industry. I think sometimes they might bring that into that. It really, really depends. Honestly, I've heard of people being in like interviews for banks, for example, because at banks they are hiring a lot more data scientists at banks nowadays. Surprisingly, you're not expected to know too many of the finance terms. Once in a while, I remember I have one friend who they asked, are you aware of these, like something about valuating stocks or something? And she said, no, I actually don't know what this means, but you just have to show that you're willing to learn. And I think that's fine. I think it's more, yeah, it's a balance of, it really depends. It's a hard question to answer, but I think in terms of domain knowledge, read up as much as you can. They may or may not ask you things like that, but ultimately at that stage, I think you just want to impress them in any way you can. I know that's really vague, but honestly, every like this style of interview I've had has turned out quite different in terms of the things that they asked about. But I think the common thread that they have is they want to know more about me because they would likely be the people that I would be working directly with. And also that you are able to think on the same wavelength as they are, I guess. Yeah, that was a very rambly answer, but yeah. I am in the progress of getting some of my former students and classmates to come and talk to you all. So you can ask them those questions too. But yeah, anything else?
What about in-person versus Zoom? Any specific challenges with remote Zoom interviewing?
To be honest, so I did most of my interviewing before COVID. I was interviewing for a short period during like the start of COVID. I actually don't think it is harder. If I personally haven't seen big differences between like questions asked. I guess with Zoom you have more flexibility of even working remote. But for me, in my experience, not particularly. No. And also since COVID, I haven't like seen many students in person. So I will also caveat again that a lot of this is based on information that things that I've been told about pre-COVID. But I don't think that the interview processes have changed too much. Of course, everything is now over Zoom. I think in terms of like, one thing that I find hard to do is like, and I'm sure you all now having been in this program and like having one-on-ones with me, something that I've had to get used to is like when to talk is a kind of awkward thing to get used to, because I feel like in person, if you kind of start to talk over each other, it's more natural. But on Zoom, you're not sure when someone's about to say something. That kind of scenario makes it a little bit awkward. But other than like the little weird like social nuances that change in person versus virtual, I don't think the interview process itself is different. But yeah, that's actually a good thing. I want to see if I'm going to see if I have any students who like did their interview process during COVID. I think I can definitely look for some, but yeah, that's a good point to bring up. Cool. Anything else? We're wow, almost that time. I didn't expect this to take a whole hour, but yeah. Anything else? Okay, well, I'm just going to make sure that that these sentences are coherent before I send these out. And yeah, feel free to send me any other questions that you have or any thoughts. Happy to also talk about these at your one-on-ones. Your career coach will also offer a different perspective on each of these. So ask them as well to get their thoughts. And oh yeah, if anyone hasn't heard from a career coach by now, like a career coach should have reached out to you via your email. If anyone hasn't received anything, do let me know, because they should have done so by yesterday. So if anyone hasn't heard from a career coach, Slack me and let me know. All right then, if there's nothing else, tomorrow I'll talk about preparing your MVP presentations. I'll also prepare like a list of like, I'm just going to randomly do it. Who's going to present on which day next week. It's going to be very, very informal, so don't worry about it. So yeah, cool. I will talk to you all tomorrow then. Have a good rest of your day, everybody. And as usual, any questions, please send them over.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. Bye, everyone.